All right, everybody, we're moving on to community ecology. So, how do we define a community? Well, a community in this case is kind of one level up of population. So, it's a group of populations of different species that live close enough to interact. So when we were talking about populations, it was an individual species in a given area. Now we're kind of just lumping together all of those populations that live in an area and calling it a community because they do interact with one another. These are called interspecific interactions. So interspecific meaning between different species. And they can be positive, negative, or neutral, depending on the situation. So here we just kind of include the fact of, competition generally hurts everyone. Predation, one thing eats another. So there's a winner and a loser, designated by the little plus minus. And then herbivory, we don't really think about, but obviously when an animal eats a plant, the plant is losing, so plus minus. There are also things called symbiosis, and that's where two organisms are closely living together. It does not always mean that everything is sunshine and rainbows. That would be mutualism. Everybody's winning. Both partners get something positive in return from the relationship, but it's not always the case. Parasites are another example of symbiosis. And there is something called commensalism, where one thing is benefiting and the other really just is there. It doesn't have a benefit, but it's also not hurt by the situation. So this chart kind of puts it all together too. So you do need to know the differences between all of these and the vocabulary that goes with them. The plus minuses kind of get lumped into the interaction type called exploitation, because one is benefiting and one is not. And then commensalism, though both are not benefiting, they do kind of go into the idea of positive interactions. Okay, so competition. When does this happen? Resources are in short supply. So oftentimes what happens in this case, it can be the same species. It could also be different species. Here it says same species fight, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But thinking about density dependent factors and eventually resources become short, then individuals are going to start to compete over those limited resources, whether it's food or shelter or something else. There is also something called the competitive exclusion principle. It's kind of a bigger picture thing. Two species cannot coexist in a community if their niches are identical. Their niche is kind of like their pocket within the bigger community where they live and thrive. So the idea is that no two species can actually fill the exact same spot in the exact same role in a community. For some reason or another, one of those is going to be slightly more advantageous than the other, or slightly more high in terms of fitness and reproductive success. And that over time, eventually one will have to eliminate the other. There's also this thing called resource partitioning. And what that means is that different species parse out niches to be slightly different. So if there are two very, very similar species, they kind of partition their resources or separate themselves out so that they can actually coexist. And every time I think of that, I always think of those anole lizards that differentiate themselves amongst the parts of a rainforest tree. So there's ones that live in the canopy, ones that live on the branches, ones that live down at the bottom. So that would be an example of where similar species have learned to coexist because they have partitioned their resources. So the niche, again, is the sum total of all of an organism's uses of abiotic and biotic resources in the environment. And that niche can be fundamental or realized. So fundamental is kind of like the theoretical niche that could be occupied. And you can kind of see that here, the fundamental niche of this particular species could be everything from high tide to low tide, whereas the realized is where it actually occupies. So in this particular case, there are 2 species, and this one really is only up here, whereas this other one is down. So they've kind of partitioned their resources, so to speak. So even though in theory or fundamentally that, I guess, brown barnacle could cover the entire area, its realized niche or its actual partitioning of resources is not quite as much. So now we're going to talk about predation a tiny bit. There are a number of things that organisms have evolved over time, thinking about natural selection, acting on some of these things for prey to hopefully evade predation. That's kind of their goal for survival, right? So there are a number of different things that have evolved as defense mechanisms to prevent being eaten. And this might be cryptic coloration. So camouflage, as we know, is a super important thing. It could be warning colorations, and that could be poisonous animals. I think of poison dart frogs and certain species of snakes that have super bright coloration to kind of visually let predators know that they are poisonous, and therefore the predators just avoid eating them altogether. Which, as a result, we now have something called Batesian mimicry. And what that means is that a harmless species has come to look like a species with harmful coloration. So it appears in coloring to look like a poisonous species, even though itself is not. And so just as a warning sign, if a predator sees it, they see the coloring, assume that it's poisonous, but it's not. And so you can imagine the adaptive success that having something like that would have, even though the species itself isn't poisonous. The next is Müllerian mimicry. So this is where 2 bad tasting species resemble each other. So there's kind of a co-success in showing these specific colors or 2 bad things looking like each other. Then that means every time a predator comes in contact with either one, they know to avoid it. So it kind of just shows things to be avoided. And then we have herbivory. So plants have lots of defense mechanisms, and that could include toxins that come out of the plant. If you spikes, thorns, all of those things on the stems of plants, those are meant to try to detract predators and herbivores from eating the plant itself. Okay, so here's a couple of examples of that. We have camouflage, obviously. Here we have specific coloration, so like poison dart frogs. And then here, for example, the cuckoo bee is looking like a yellow jacket in order to appear poisonous and or not, I mean, not poisonous. Yellow jackets aren't poisonous, but they are pretty nasty. So they look and appear that way so that predators will stay away from them. Okay, moving on to things like symbiosis. That's where 2 species are living in direct contact with one another. Mutualism could be an example of, in this case, these ants and this plant that has these thorns on it. So, for example, the ants can get some food and shelter. It's also possible that the plant gets extra protection from the ants themselves. Commensalism, in this case, the birds hanging out on the wildebeest. The birds are getting extra vantage points, extra protection from predators, and the wildebeest don't really care. So that would be an example where they're not really benefiting, but they're not also harmed by the birds hanging out on their back. Okay, so community structure. One thing to kind of measure the health of a community is to look at species diversity. And higher diversity is considered good in the course of, evolution and overall success over time. So diversity is really looked at in terms of 2 things: species richness So how many different kinds of species exist, and relative abundance. So how many of each one of those species. It's a combination of both of those things. And there's a special formula called the Shannon Diversity Index that is a special calculation that comes out with a diversity number at the end by looking at both richness and abundance. And the general idea here is that if you do have a very diverse community, meaning rich and abundant, then it's more able to resist things like invasive species, which I'll talk about in a second. So, invasive species. They are organisms that become established outside of their native range, meaning that all organisms kind of have an origin, or they are native to a certain location on the earth. And if for some reason, humans are an excellent example of accidentally moving species from one area to another, or introducing species in an area where it's never been before. So you take something from one place and you move it to another. Well, now it's in this new habitat or environment that it didn't have before. And maybe it doesn't have any predators in this new environment, or maybe it is suddenly the most fit thing in this new environment. Well, now it has the ability to really move in and take over. Invasive species are not really a good thing because they oftentimes take over niches that other species were occupying. And maybe those other species are not quite as fit. And so the invasive species end up overrunning everything. Kudzu is one example here down at the bottom in Japan. You can see that this particular vine is overrunning everything. It doesn't have any natural predators. And what it ends up doing is that it kind of shuts out trees and shrubs, and then there's going to be consequences because then goats won't be able to eat food or graze like they normally would. There's tons of other invasive species that exist. Dutch elm disease is another one. It's a particular fungus that was carried by beetles. So again, this is a human problem. We brought in wood from the Netherlands, and on that wood were these magical beetles that carried this fungus. And elm trees all across the United States and Europe and Canada basically were overrun by this fungus. And now we are trying to cultivate resistant strains using kind of biotechnology to make that happen because they are so susceptible. Let's see. Potato blight is another one. It's another fungus, and that was the true instigator of the potato famine. Again, this is a people problem because it arrived in Ireland from ships that came from the US. And the problem was that all across the entirety of Ireland, there was only one species of potato planted. And if we circle back to the idea of having diverse communities is really what is resistant to invasive species. The fact that there was only one, and that one happened to be susceptible to potato blight, this particular fungus, well, then that pretty much took out all the potatoes. Before I head on to another one that's really, really common here is the emerald ash borer. So there are little tiny invasive bugs that go into ash trees, and that's been a common thing even here in Franklin. As time has gone on, you can kind of crack open an ash tree and see the insides. Okay, trophic structures. So moving kind of towards how an ecosystem is set up, there are relationships between different organisms, and they organize themselves into something called a trophic structure. It basically has to do with who eats who. So a trophic level are the specific links, and thinking about the transfer of food energy. So where is food going, or who eats whom, and thinking about that every time we eat something, it's really the ingestion of energy. So plants, being the super awesome autotrophs that they are, they make food from the sun, so they themselves have tons of food energy. And then that energy gets transferred to a herbivore when it eats it, and that gets transferred to a carnivore that eats it, and then that gets eventually to things called decomposers, because once an organism dies, well, things like mushrooms and other decomposers can come in and basically eat the dead animal, and they then ingest the energy. And all of that particular links are together known as a food chain. Here's another example of some pictures of what that might look like and what their names are. So plants and other phototrophic organisms, meaning they can use light to make their own food, those are called primary producers. They are producing the food. And then the thing that eats them, herbivores, are called primary consumers. They're consumers because they need to eat something else to sustain themselves. So the first round is primary. And then if something eats that, they're called secondary. And if something eats that, they're called tertiary, which is the fancy way to say 3. And if something eats that, they're called quaternary, which is the fancy word for 4. It's also important to know that certain organisms can exist in multiple levels. Like humans, sometimes we're primary consumers because we eat plants sometimes. Sometimes we're secondary consumers or tertiary or quaternary, depending on what specific meat item we might be eating. So we can occupy different levels, but that's just kind of how that works. But thinking about, we really don't go past quaternary. Food chains are limited in how long they can actually make a chain. And really the result of that is because energy transfer is really low. And if you keep going and going and going, then it's not really worth it in terms of ingesting an organism, because you're not gaining as much energy as you would if you ate a plant, for example. Food chains don't really exist in isolation, so we link them together and we create something called food webs. Excuse me. So thinking about how things are really embedded and how organisms can really exist at multiple levels, a given species may weave into this web at more than one. And so they might have multiple arrows coming in and coming out of them. Whenever you see a food web, please note that the arrow indicates where the energy is going. So it's kind of going from the prey to the predator. So thinking about, the photosynthetic things, all the arrows are coming out of them because they're eaten. They don't eat things. And then the top consumer has all the arrows coming into it because nothing eats that. And so you can kind of see how everything plays into each other, and some things are more important than others in the middle of that web. So there is something called a dominant species in a food web. And basically it's the thing that's just the most abundant. It has the most biomass, meaning that it weighs the most, or it's the most abundant in the community. A keystone species is basically like the top organism. It has control over the whole thing. And it has dominance over the ecological niche. And thinking about if you removed that keystone species, it has clear domino effects on the rest. So for example, sea otters, I don't know if it's tied to the last one. Hold on. Just looking. It is not tied to that specific one, but sea otters, for example, eat urchins. So if I lost the sea otter, well, then now no one's there to eat the urchins. So then the urchins are going to come in and eat a ton of what they normally eat, which are the kelp forests. Grizzly bears eat salmon. So normally when they eat salmon, they're basically taking energy from the water and moving it to the land, because grizzly bears don't live in the water, they just hunt in the water. So it's kind of a way to bring energy and nutrients from the water to the land. Prairie dogs have different roles. For example, FYI, I used to have a prairie dog when I was little. His name was Rigby, and you pretty much take care of them like guinea pigs. But prairie dogs burrow, And when they do that, just by the nature of making their home, not necessarily what they're eating, they aerate the soil and they trim vegetation. So they have, outside of just, what they eat, they have natural benefits by what they do. So a disturbance in these niches and in these communities can actually have sometimes drastic consequences on the diversity and composition of that community. So a disturbance might mean that you remove an organism. It could also mean one gets introduced, like an invasive species. Or it could be changing the resource availability. Something happens. Thinking about all of those abiotic factors. Maybe there's a fire or a drought or a flood, or humans coming down to cut down all the trees. Those types of things. So oftentimes what might happen is something called ecological succession. And that has to do with a transition in the species of a given area over a certain period of time. So certain events might cause certain species to die off or move away. And so that causes fluctuations and transitions in the normal diversity of a given area over a period of time. One example is primary succession. And primary succession occurs when literally the entire landscape is wiped away. This oftentimes happens after huge events like a glacier or a volcano. And when that happens, literally all of life is wiped away. There are no longer plants, nothing. So due to the lack of soil that hasn't really reformed in that given period of time, there is kind of a certain flow of things that come in, and they're called lichens usually for the first piece. And then eventually, as those first round of organisms come back, then we can start to get plants and shrubs, and then start to get other plants, and then other animals can start to come back. So it's really a very, very long process of kind of getting back some of those species that had been lost. Secondary succession is a little bit different. The soil is left intact, so it's not so catastrophic that you even lose soil, but it might be a fire that has occurred. So all of the plants might be dead, but there is still soil there. Or if there's kind of an abandoned farm, whatever it might be. If there's soil present, then certain plants can kind of come in right away, and then the community can begin to recover. It doesn't take nearly as long for a community to recover. Humans, we destroy a lot of things. Trawling is one instance of where we kind of go through and we drag for fish, for example, to catch, to eat. And there are drastic consequences to that. Coral reefs are destroyed. The diversity of fish are almost gone, those types of things. So we do have a general impact on various ecological communities based on our human habits. This one I feel like I don't really need to go over right now, but pathogens can alter community structure. So there are disease-causing microorganisms out there. It used to be that Zika was a thing, but we are presently at home and quarantined by the coronavirus. So excellent example. But when it gets introduced to a new habitat, so in this case, infecting humans, it had disastrous effects. And when people travel, they of course bring this thing everywhere. And therefore it can transport pathogens from one area to another. Or as we saw with a lot of the invasive species, we have a tendency to accidentally bring things from one place to another that can have detrimental consequences. All right, that's the end of this PowerPoint.